Hello and welcome back for another installment in our Courtroom Confidential Conversations series. For this episode, please join me in welcoming Ian Runkle, a criminal defense attorney and firearms lawyer in Alberta, Canada, and the host of the wildly popular YouTube channel Runkle of the Bailey. Ian, hello, my friend. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. And pretty good, as much as you can be with the chaos going on here in Firearms Law, but that's its own topic.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too because I find that fascinating. I know that you found this niche that you've kind of made your home, but the point of us starting this whole series and having these conversations is that so many people who are subscribers to our channel and fans of us are also subscribers and fans of you and many other channels. But we found that people don't really know about the person behind it, the creator. And we thought, you know what, let's just start interviewing these people. And we've had a lot of really positive feedback. And we asked folks, who else do you want to hear from? And your name is one of the names that we got quite often of people saying, "Hey, could you interview Ian from Runkle of the Bailey?" So that's why you're on the hot seat today. So the biggest question to begin with is kind of tell us about yourself before this whole crazy YouTube world started.
I mean, just kind of slogging along as a criminal defense lawyer. I mean, just you do what you can. And I was always, I guess, the guy making not a lot of money. So I ended up leaving one firm in part because they got annoyed at me about and I say in part because there was another major reason that I won't go into here, but they got annoyed at me for doing like free work. So I was like, well, I want to be able to do that. So I left and was on my own and, just kind of struggling along and keeping the bills paid, but doing what you can. So
When you went to law school, is that kind of always what you knew you wanted to get into was criminal defense?
criminal defense, well, at least criminal law. I wasn't sure about prosecution versus defense initially. And then I sort of settled that defense was where I wanted to be. And at the end of the day, I kind of like the idea that you're often defending sort of the little guy. And there's a surprising number of people who are either innocent or at least not as guilty as charged, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So you'll get cases of, for example, like guys accused of robbing a liquor store. And it turns out he bought liquor he knew was stolen, but he didn't actually rob the liquor store. And that can be a huge difference for sentencing. And so you're having to run these cases going, listen, we know he did a thing and it's a bad thing, but at the same time, it's not the bad thing that you were identifying. Or you get guys who are suspected in some serious crime, but they're also found with some drugs on them. And so, they may not be completely innocent people, but you're still like, but at the end of the day, the other thing that is great about criminal defense is that you get to defend rights all the time. You're defending rights because when somebody's charged, often the issues are issues of whether or not their rights were violated. They made a statement. Was that a statement that happened after they said, I want to talk to a lawyer? And the officer said, yeah, you watch too many TV shows. That's a pretty clear violation of rights, but I've had that case. And then the reason why you defend that person is not necessarily that you are this most thrilled about this guy, but by defending that person, you're also defending your rights if you're ever arrested and everyone else's rights. So I kind of like criminal defense. It's kind of it's the area of law that interests me most. And it's kind of been my focus. So
I had a colleague who is a older defense attorney who used to say that he was in law enforcement, and because he's enforcing the law against the government. So it's the same thing. Like you said, you're fighting for people's rights. It's enforcing the law. It's making sure that the government is behaving just as much as your client might be behaving.
and that's the thing is in the ideal system, the law is as much of a shield for the ordinary person as it is a sword for the government. Because, while the government may charge you with they say you stole a car or something like that. They're still required to play by certain rules. They're required to give you a fair trial. They're required to give you the evidence that they have both for and against you. They're required to, not beat you with a hose to make you confess. Um,
What?
and the thing is, we laugh about these things, but the reason we have these rights is because without them, those things happen. And as much as you might go, well, that's a little extreme, it's only extreme because we have rules that say that they can't do it, and that those rules get enforced by a court. So, and we have this experience in Canada. Canada's rights document is actually fairly new. Our charter came in the 80s. And so what would happen beforehand is, let's say the police kick down your door to search your house, and they've done so without any grounds, right? They just, they think you're the usual suspect, or, they got a report that a guy with long white hair committed the crime, and they're like, I've watched YouTube. I know a guy who does that. Let's go look in his house. And they have no basis to think it might actually be me as opposed to anyone else, but they just decide they want to have a look at my house just to be, just out of an abundance of caution. So if you don't have those rights, what they'd do is they'd kick in your door, have a look around, absolutely traumatize you, and then your remedy to that would be to sue them, and you would get to sue them for like the cost of your door.
And
And you're thinking,
what if they find some evidence?
well, then you could sue them for the cost of your door, like you get $800 to fix your door, but you still go to jail.
Wow.
And what would end up happening is that the police officer who kicked down your door would be viewed as a hero and wouldn't have to pay that $800 personally in any event. So there was absolutely no incentive for the police to not kick down your door. Whereas now, with a rights document that allows for exclusion of evidence, if they kick down your door and they find all sorts of things, that cop isn't the hero. That cop is the jerk who screwed up a perfectly good investigation by jumping the gun, because he's blown the case, not made the case.
Right.
And so that has a tremendous impact just on how police go about their day-to-day activities. And it's important.
And you're saying that this was a change in the law in Canada in the 80s?
Yep, I'm just looking, pulling up. I think it was 1982, but I'm not good with
Because this,
dates.
as you're telling me, is absolutely blowing my mind as a person who practices criminal law here in the United States, because that has just been around for hundreds of years with us. I mean, that was part of our founding documents. So I cannot believe how it must have been like. It doesn't sound like I can't imagine, given your age, you were practicing before any of that, but I can't imagine what it was like before any of that.
2 years old
Right,
when the
yeah.
charter came in. 1982. So it's different, and Canada's Charter of Rights is inspired by the American Charter of Rights in a couple of ways. So they both borrow some of the rights, but they also, in some places, were like, well, we don't want to be too much like the US. And the problem partially is that when the government says we don't want to be too much like the US, one of the things that they get concerned about is, well, that's too much freedom. That's too much power against the government. So we've got various kind of escape clauses for the government built into our charter. So one of the big ones is Section 1, which says that any of the rights in it apply to the extent that is, I think the language is, demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society.
Oh boy.
So what that
Sounds like
means is
there's a
that
lot of wiggle room in that.
a lot, because, for instance, like random stops to check your sobriety. Like you're driving along and the police just are like, I want to stop that guy just to see if he's drunk. There's no indication that he's drunk. He's not driving badly, but I just want to see. The court has said, well, that is an infringement of your rights not to be detained arbitrarily and not to be searched without good reason. But we're going to allow it because we think that's fine in a free and democratic society. Whereas I am not really that thrilled about that. I don't like the idea that they can stop me randomly when there's no indication that I've done anything wrong, not even a single traffic violation. So, the flip side is sometimes it can result in more expansive rights, but I say this in some circumstances. Because sometimes they will say things like, this activity in this particular case violated someone's rights, but we're going to allow the evidence in. There's a separate section for when evidence is obtained in violation of a right. There is a question of whether it should be allowed in or not. It's whether this would sort of offend the administration of justice. And so what that can mean is that sometimes in the US, they'll sort of read a right down and they'll sort of narrowly constrain that right. In Canada, they'll often say it's a little wider, the right, but then they'll just let evidence through
They'll
anyway
just
in
chop it
cases.
apart with this escape clause.
And the problem that, this is sort of different ways of dealing with the really hard cases. Like, police officers walking by on the street and, he gets a weird feeling about a car and he opens it up and there's a dead body in the trunk. And so in the US they might say, well, that you didn't have a right not to have your trunk searched because they really want to get that evidence in, and then that ends up narrowing the right if they do that. Whereas in Canada they'd say, oh yeah, that definitely violated his right, but given that it's a dead body, like we're looking at a murder, we're going to still allow the evidence in. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
complicated thing, but overall I kind of prefer the US system of rights you actually know matter. It can be really hard to explain to a client. Okay, so what the court did is they found that they definitely shouldn't have searched your house, but you still are going to jail. Like,
Yeah.
what do you mean I'm
Well,
still going to jail?
Well, you make a good point though. It is when you're explaining it, it does sound like I would prefer the way at least it's written in the US. But I will tell you that there is a big difference between how a judge views a improper search and seizure when it comes to a bag of weed being found under your car seat or a human head. If
Yep.
it really comes down to it, they're gonna find some wiggle room in there to make sure that the right person goes to jail.
And it's just different ways of wiggle room. In the
Yeah,
US, the wiggle room is the search was perfectly fine.
yeah,
In Canada, the wiggle room is usually, well, the search was still awful, but we're letting it through because it's a human head. And in some ways that's kind of more honest, because the court can just say
yeah,
this is super awful like this. But we have had some case law where they've excluded some pretty serious things. There's a case not too long ago where they excluded several kilograms of drugs, and not weed, several
right,
kilograms
right.
of not weed. And the court was like, yeah, this is a serious violation and you guys knew you were violating his rights at the time, so no deal.
Yeah,
um
yeah.
it's
Wow. I got to tell you, I am geeking out talking to you about this because I feel like I could talk to you about this for a long time because I just find it fascinating the difference in neighboring countries, how the laws can be so different. Uh, but I'm going to spare our audience all of that geek talk because I know that people want to hear more about you. But one of the things I think is fascinating about you is it's not just criminal law that you've decided to focus on, but you have a big interest in kind of firearms law. Tell us about that. Tell us the passion that you have for that, because I know it's not just your practice of law; it's also other aspects of your life.
So basically the way that started, when I was a kid, I did not do much with guns because my mom did not like guns. I don't think she does still, but she is kind of tolerant of the fact that I do. But in law school is stressful, and you're sitting there and there's a lot of times where it's just, you are just maybe overwhelmed and you need to take your mind off of all of this. And so I went, I need a hobby. I need something to do that isn't just agonizing over my next exam. And I looked around at my friends, and a lot of them had developed a hobby, which was drinking. And I thought, that's not a great path, right? And some of the people from my law school have flamed out of being lawyers because that was the hobby that they leaned into.
Wow.
It's not a healthy one.
Yeah.
But I remembered I'd gone and shot like a little 22 with my dad sometimes, and I was like, I like that. Let's try that. So I went and got my license and got a little 22 rifle and thought, you know, there's actually this case about an articling student, which is sort of a lawyer in training. Here, after you go through law school, you have to do a year of articling before you can actually be a full lawyer. So you get this sort of half lawyer apprenticeship. And there was a guy who was
Probably smart, by the way. It sounds like a smart
yeah.
idea.
They let you do some things, but basically the rule of thumb is that anything that is too difficult to fix if you screw it up has to be done by a real lawyer. So you can do like trials on less serious matters, you can do bail hearings, you can do all of these kinds of things, but like you couldn't run a murder trial as an articling student because obviously not. But and I'm guessing like most lawyers in the US are probably wise enough not to take a murder their first year, but
I don't know. Maybe most, but not all.
yeah, and then they show up in the disciplinary records or the ineffective assistance of counsel records or something like that. But this articling student got busted drunk driving. And he basically went and, he was convicted and he said, you should show me some mercy because I'm just a student. This is going to blow up my legal career. And the court said, actually, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to hit you extra hard because you should know better as an articling student. And that kind of put a little fear into me. And I said, I should really know the gun laws because if I'm going to own a gun and do all these things, I can't be that guy.
Yeah.
That guy is having a real bad day. So I started reading the gun laws and I went, I must be really stupid because I don't understand this. This makes no sense. And so I read more and I went, oh, it isn't that I don't understand this. It makes no sense. It's that I understand it and it makes no sense. And when you see an area of law that's just such a disaster, and I mean, let's give you an example here. Let's say a guy is caught, um, he's caught with a kilogram of cocaine. He goes to jail. He does, 8 years. He gets out. He gets a job as a roofer and they hand him a nail gun. He's now committed a crime because in
No
Canada, that nail
way.
gun is probably considered a firearm. And so he would have been on a firearm ban from his conviction. So, and I'm thinking the whole point of this law was never to prevent this guy from getting out of his drug conviction and getting an honest job and trying to just live his life. That wasn't the idea, but it ends up being banned. We can go a little step further. Canadian law defines that every firearm is always a weapon in any circumstance. So let's say you have an airsoft gun, and the airsoft gun looks kind of like a real gun, and you want to go play airsoft, so you want to take it on the bus. But you don't want to have something that looks like an AR-15 on the bus because here in Canada, there is no sort of open carry of stuff like that. It's gonna get some attention. And so you decide, I'm going to put this into a case so that nobody will be afraid of the fact that I've got this. That may be the crime of carrying a concealed weapon because the airsoft gun, because it's a firearm, because of weird loopholes in our airsoft rules, and it must be a weapon, therefore it can't be carried concealed. And it seems absolutely bizarre to people that the law may require you to carry that airsoft gun openly and notoriously rather than carrying it. And in fact, the police get this one wrong all the time because the police will often make statements going, if you are an airsoft person, you should totally not, you should totally not, carry this publicly. We hate getting calls about about all of this. So
Wow.
it's when the police don't even get the law right. It's I mean, I am kind of an academic geek about the law, and so part of why I just got really into firearm law was it's so fascinating to find all of these little nooks and crannies and weird edge cases and weird, applications. And sometimes that can be great for clients because I've had a number of cases where the prosecutors come in really confident that the law says one thing, and then they leave going, I didn't know the law worked like that.
Yeah.
And they have lost.
Wow.
So that's
Yeah, I will say too that in the US, the gun laws are also incredibly dense and sometimes draconian, and sometimes you feel like the person who was drafting them has never held a gun in their entire life when it comes down to, things like barrel length and stock
we have
length
that.
and all of this kind of stuff that turns it, I've handled cases where people are just, doing as much as they possibly, gunsmiths who are working in this field and doing something that they feel is absolutely following the letter of the law, and a law enforcement person who works for, something like the DEA that should know about firearms, uh, just views that same law differently, and neither one of them have a ill intent behind it. It's just the law can be read completely and honestly differently, and it causes a lot of trouble.
And I find I when I've gone to the States, it's even worse when you're a foreigner going to the States. Because sometimes it's things like, okay, well, you can possess a firearm if you have a hunting license.
Mhm.
And so I've ended up buying hunting licenses for like animals I don't intend, like, I don't plan to go hunting. And usually there's a cheap license for like hunting exotics.
Uh-huh.
And so it'll be something like if I see a rhinoceros in Texas, I can
you're
shoot it.
you're good,
But
yeah.
I'm like, I just want to go to a range. That's all I want to do. So it becomes its own weird thing. And you're right, you get people who are 100% sort of morally innocent. I had a guy call me up, he's a gunsmith, and he got hired to cut down a shotgun. And the problem is that he mismeasured
Ah,
because in Canada there is a specific law for how far you can cut down a shotgun, and he'd cut it down about 2 millimeters. So like, you
incredible.
know, an eighth of an inch sort of thing, too short. And he's like, "What do I do?" And the problem is, the even worse thing is that if that gun had been that length from the manufacturer, as opposed to this guy trying to cut it down, it would be fully legal, no problem. But because he was cutting it down, it's like, now I've accidentally committed a crime. What do I do? And it's like, okay, let's get this sorted out. And
Yeah.
it's really hard to explain to sort of the average person and even a lot of gun owners just how weird this law can be sometimes. But that's what I find fascinating and fun is those weird edge cases and the places where there's just interesting arguments because self-defense law is everyone asks me like if somebody comes into my house and they've got a gun, can I shoot them first? And the answer is, well, that's super complicated. And I can't give you a blanket answer because that can turn on really tiny, subtle distinctions and little tiny elements. And that's always super unsatisfying, but it's fun for me as a lawyer. I always warn clients, I'm like, don't have a file I like because the ones I like best are the complicated, weird, arguable issues. And I'm like, yeah, you don't want that.
um so you are out of law school. You've gone through what did you call it again? What is that apprenticeship period called?
Articling. Yeah,
Articling period.
articling.
You've gone to a firm that didn't work out. Now you're on your own, and somewhere along the line, how does the brilliant idea of I'm going to get on this thing called YouTube and start talking about this stuff? How does that all come
So
about?
I started a Facebook page just for, A, marketing, and B, just kind of to share weird, like these weird little legal things. I'd just go up and I'd write up a post about it and post it up online. And there's this one guy who's like always in my DMs, and he was saying, "You need to make YouTube videos." And I went, "Nobody wants to watch that. I'm kind of a shy, awkward, geeky kind of person. I'm not the sort of entertainer type." And he just would not stop. Like, just over and over and over again, this guy was like, "You need to make YouTube videos." So finally, the government passed some new restrictions. I forget what it was that actually was at the time because it was several years ago. But I I was like, I'm tired of this guy. I'm just gonna make a video. It's gonna fail. And I can show this guy, like, look, I got 2 subscribers and like 30 views, and I don't, I spent 2 hours on this and I got nothing. So why would I do this kind of thing? And because I'm kind of shy and nervous about these things, I decided I was going to post it when my wife and I were going on a camping trip. So I was figuring I'm going to post it, and then
And then hide.
if I regret it, I'm not going to be able to easily take it down. So, fire and forget. And my wife and I were driving, and I've got my phone in my cup holder because it's, playing music, and the phone just won't stop vibrating. And my wife is like, "What is going on?" I'm like, "I don't know." She's like, "Well, if somebody's trying to get a hold of you this seriously, maybe it's something really important." So we pull over at a rest stop. I check my phone. And when you start a YouTube channel, it's trying to encourage you. So every new subscriber and every new comment you get a notification for. Whereas later on, it's like, maybe if you're getting 500 subscribers in a day, we're not going to notify you about every one. But the problem is they don't do that right at the outset. At the outset, it's every subscriber. So I think I got like it was something like 1,500 subscribers on that first video
Wow.
and tons of comments, and I was just like, "Okay, well that's blown up my email box. I don't know what to do." It took me a while longer to get to monetization because you also have to get the 4,000 watch hours, which
Uh-huh.
that's a fair bit, but I was like, I guess I have to make another video, I guess. And I just haven't stopped. And now my goal is, and I never thought this would be a goal, but it's kind of a cool goal to have now, is that one day I hope to make YouTube my primary income so that I can run a law firm entirely for free and just be like, "Listen, I'm a law firm that takes no money. I'll take files if they interest me. I'll take files if nobody else will," because there's sometimes where you've got people who they fall into that gap between, like, they can get government coverage versus they can afford a lawyer. There's a bit of a gap there, and just be like, I just want to do this to help people and not charge anybody for it. Because honestly, billing is the thing I hate most about being a lawyer. You've got some I helped this woman. She was this old grandmother, and she's living in a trailer that is parked on somebody else's land because they just are sort of doing her a solid to let her park there. She's got no water hookup. She's got no power hookup. She's just like washing her laundry with like running a hose into a bucket and then like doing. So she's got no money, like none. And then you're like, well, um, okay, I've helped you out, and now here's a bill for like 3 grand.
Right.
That that is the part of the job that absolutely sucks. And interestingly, that old woman was like, "I refuse to let you do work for free." She made me send her a bill, and she paid it by like $50 a month installments right up
Wow.
until somebody she knew died and left her some money. And she's like, "I'm paying everything now." And I was like, "Are you going to be okay?" She's like, "Oh, I've got enough. Like, I'm renting a house now. I'm going to be good." And I was like, "Okay, awesome, but I would have preferred to just say, I don't want to send you a bill. She wouldn't stand for it. She was like, nope, you will bill me. And um I hate that where you've got
Yeah.
people who are just hanging on by the skin of their teeth, and you're like, well, and it's especially bad when they are wrongfully
Yeah.
charged.
I was just going to
Um,
say it's usually the people who need the attorney's help the most who don't have the means to actually get that attorney.
I represented a guy who was caught in a vehicle where they found guns and drugs. And why was he in the vehicle? Because he was hitchhiking. And why was he hitchhiking? Because he's got no money. And so he's there, and this vehicle pulls over to pick him up and says, "Hey, we'll drive you to where you need to be." And everybody else in the car says, "Yeah, we just picked this guy up as a hitchhiker." And so when you've got a car full of people who say, including people who are like, "Yeah, I knew the guns and drugs were here, but it's really unfair that you're charging this guy because he
We just picked
he's
him
not
up.
with us."
Yeah.
And so, but they charge him, and he's sitting
Incredible.
there having to face, these criminal charges. And it's just so wildly unfair that this guy is having to do this, and you're going, well, I'll help you out. And yeah, it
Well, I wish you listen, I wish you the best and most success on YouTube, but especially if you have a noble pursuit like being able to operate a free law firm. But I want to get back to so many people who go on YouTube or any other kind of social media, they kind of languish around for a while, beating their head against the wall, shouting into an empty room, hoping somebody will notice. But you put out video number one, and all of a sudden it blows up and kind of foists this new career on you. When you first started, was it the idea of just kind of doing educational videos? Is that what you did?
yeah, and a lot of the stuff initially was just the gun community has a whole bunch of like myths and stereotypes and so forth that I was just like, okay, let's make some videos addressing this. Uh, one of the issues that people argue about all the time, and thankfully they argue about it less in Canada now because people just link to my video. And that was really kind of the idea, is to make some of these videos that people could just link to and be like, oh, right, that is not a thing. Or, yeah, that is actually a pretty serious crime that I'd be inadvertently I mentioned the carrying a firearm concealed because one of the things that people suggest all the time is like, I live in an apartment building. I don't want people seeing me walk out with my hunting rifle. How about I just put it in a guitar case? And it's like, well, Canadian law doesn't allow that. But what you can do is you can put it in like a pelican case and write firearms on the side. And the court decision said that was fine. And just hope your neighbors either can't read or don't read. Because honestly, if you see somebody walking out with a case that has something written on the side, how often do you actually read that? And they're like, well, my neighbors are really nosy. They're going to read it. I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Um, like, it is what it is. So, um, things like that. Because the thing I hate, people are always asking, like, as a defense lawyer, they're like, how can you represent bad people? And I go, bad people are my favorite because at the end of the day, if you've got a bad person who goes to jail, you go like, okay, well, I did my best, and that's just the law, right? Um, the guy who was found with the drugs is going to jail for the drugs. Okay, like he knew that was a. But the much harder situation um, is the situation where you've got somebody who is completely innocent
Yeah.
because there the stakes are really high.
Yeah.
Um, it's you don't want to be the guy who screwed up and got somebody who's innocent convicted.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be difficult, especially in the firearms sphere, because you can actually be sitting there and your first job is to explain to the judge, hey, here's the law, and it's not what you'd expect, and it's not what the prosecutor is telling you, and it's not what the police are telling you, but I really need you to read this case, and I need you to read this the actual statute and not listen to the prosecutor's description of it, because it's really technical and it's really nuanced, and it can be stressful.
Yeah.
So I would love to see a world where I never represent an innocent person because they just don't get charged, but we don't live there.
No, it's so funny you say that because I've said the exact same thing, that it's not the guilty people that I lose sleep over. It's the innocent people that are looking at, going to prison for a very long time, and it's all on me to hopefully pull off the right thing. That's where I lose the sleep for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, because as your channel evolved, I mean, you started out with a bang, but you're now into the tens and hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And congratulations. And you've created this amazing community of people. But you've gone from kind of just educational videos to now watching trials and talking about them. And a lot of the stuff that you cover is US cases. And so I'm curious, as a Canadian lawyer, do you ever find yourself confused or frustrated or bewildered by what's happening in a US courtroom?
I mean, one of the big frustrations is that I have to cover US cases, in part because Canada doesn't televise our trials.
Yeah.
And so we'll have these big trials and people are like, "Are you going to cover this?" And I go, "Well, how?" Because even if I go and sit and watch through the entire trial, I'll come out and I'll be like, "Well, this witness was really sketchy." And people go, "How do I know they were sketchy?" And I'm like,
I'm telling
"Take
you.
my word for it."
Yeah.
And it's really different than when you've got people watching it, especially because sometimes the audience has a different view of a witness. And frankly, the audience's view is usually better than mine because the audience is closer to the jury than I am. I will look at things and I'll be like, I've cross examined a dozen people. I think this is, or dozens and dozens and dozens. And, I think this guy's a liar because he does X, Y, and Z. And they're like, I don't see that. I see it. And the problem is if I'm sitting there and I know the guy's a liar and the prosecutor knows the guy's a liar and the judge knows the guy's a liar and the jury doesn't, um, my client's getting convicted.
Yeah.
And um, so I like that you get that feedback. I wish I could cover Canadian cases. I'm going to start doing the only court that televises in Canada is the Supreme Court. So it's an appellate court. You don't get
Which
to see
is
any witnesses.
so ironic because the only court that isn't televised in the US is the Supreme Court.
It's kind of backwards, but
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I would love to do just is to get permission to cover a nothing burger case in Canada. And just, guy walks into a liquor store, steals a bottle of booze, and walks out. And he's, you know, and the thing is that this is a case that happens thousands of times in Canada in the average week. Like it's everywhere. And this, when we talk about like the ordinary person should understand what our court system looks like. And sometimes that's not the big dramatic cases. Like we've had
Yeah.
huge murders and,
Excellent point. Yeah.
and the thing is in those cases, you get to see what it looks like when there's a team of prosecutors and sometimes a team of defense lawyers, millions of dollars being spent, and, you know, the investigation purse strings are just unlimited.
Yeah.
Like you look at the United Healthcare CEO killing. When you ask what the budget is to investigate that, the budget is just, an infinity symbol.
Yeah.
It's as much as the taxpayer can possibly support. So, um, but in the average case, they can't do that. And that includes sometimes following up on really obvious leads. So you'll get like a break and enter, and it's like, and we found fingerprints. And it's like, and did you run those fingerprints? No.
Hmm.
Why not? Well, because that would cost money. And this is like a break and enter where somebody stole like an Xbox, and that's it. And not even like the latest Xbox. They stole like an old Xbox. And, you know, And it'll be like, and this is also hard to explain to the public sometimes because they'll get broken into and they might be very poor and somebody's stolen their computer that's worth $300, but to them it's everything and it's irreplaceable. And the guy who stole it like cut himself with a knife because he decided to make a sandwich, which is actually surprisingly common. And so there's blood all over the place. The guy's left a big bloody fingerprint on their fridge. And they're like, you should be able to get this guy. You've got DNA,
Mhm.
you got fingerprints. I'm sure he's in your databases because he's done it before. And the police are just like,
Yep.
I don't know what to
Yeah.
tell you. We're not doing that.
Yeah,
Um,
I've had to, explain that to jurors too, potential jurors when I was a prosecutor that, "Hey, by the way, this isn't CSI. If you think that we have satellite imagery and DNA and forensics did a full sweep and we've got fingerprints and carpet fibers and everything else, save yourself. This may come down to me calling a witness who says that's the guy that did it, and that's all I'm going to put in front of you."
and as a defense lawyer, I'm usually arguing the other. I'm like, they have blood. Why are they not testing the blood?
Right,
Is
right.
it because they think it might not match my dude and they don't want to blow up their case? Think
Yeah.
about that. And sometimes jurors who've been watching way too much CSI will be like, "Oh, I totally think that's, it." But that cuts both ways. Um, they'll say, "Why didn't they test the blood? Maybe there's something wrong with this investigation." I'm like, there is no conspiracy about this investigation on a like burglary into some dude's shed, but I mean, there might be sloppy police work, but it's not a conspiracy. But as a defense lawyer, sometimes we've got what I call like bogus DNA, where they'll just throw in DNA and it doesn't matter. Example, case where they find this car it's a stolen car. It's been abandoned in the woods. How long has it been there? Well, long enough for the tires to go flat, long enough for the rain to ruin this car, long enough that like squirrels have built a nest in there. But they're doing their investigation, and for some reason they decide to actually run DNA on this one, and they find a cigarette butt in the ashtray, and they pull that out and they run DNA, and it matches to a guy, and that guy has a lengthy history of car theft. And they're like, "Well, we got our guy," and I'm going,
Mhm.
this case is garbage because you have no way of knowing how that cigarette butt gets in there. Was it in there because the guy stole the car, was smoking, and left it there? That's a possibility. Was it getting in there because the guy found a car in the middle of the woods and decided to just sit there and use it as a spot to have a smoke? That's a possibility. Did the car thief pick up a cigarette butt and put it in there just to mess with the investigation? Also a possibility. You can have DNA transfer. And the problem is the jury just hears DNA,
Mm, it's
and they have some very studious looking expert in a suit and tie who will testify very conclusively about how this is a millions to one match. And the jury's like, well, I'm ready to convict. So, although here in Canada, the what is it? We also have we have a lot more bench trials than jury trials.
Oh, interesting.
So, and for something like that, I would much rather have a bench trial any day of the
Yeah.
week. Because the jury will hear DNA and they'll be like convicting. The judge will hear that and they'll just be like, Crown, which is what we call our prosecutors. Um, do you really want to? Is this your case? Is there
Yeah.
more coming?
Yeah.
And I remember one moment the prosecutor concluded their case. They're done. And he says, the judge says, Mr. Runkle, do you have an application? And so what the court is inviting me to do is to make a non-suit application to basically say there's no evidence to allow a decision possibly against my client. So I make the non-suit application and he denies it. He says, I am not able to grant this because there is some evidence on which a jury could possibly convict, even though it was a judge alone trial. He says, no matter how flimsy it is and how much the credibility of this witness was shaken, on cross-examination, there was still some evidence on every element, and therefore I have to deny your non-suit application, even though it was a close call. So he invites me to make the application. He denies it, and then he's like, Mr. Runkle, did you want to call any evidence? And I'm like, well, after you've just said that their case is such like clearly garbage, but you can't non-suit it, I'm not going to call any evidence. No. And he's like, well, then I'm acquitting. But it's we end up with these cases where it's just like, why does this happen? And I've also had situations where like somebody gets up on the stand, they testify, and you cross-examine, and the Crown prosecutor just goes, we're done.
That's
That's a lot of
interesting.
fun too. So yeah.
Um, I'm curious. You said initially that one of the reasons you were hesitant to get involved with YouTube was that you're not a person who kind of seeks to be in front of a camera. You're not. It's not your comfort zone. But now you're at a point where you're doing things like live streams and interaction with subscribers and commenters and everything else. How has that experience been for you? Do you enjoy it? Do you struggle with it? Talk to us about that.
It's kind of a mix. I still get nervous. I still have a really hard time. I mean, one of the things I would like to be better at is going through and like editing for shorts and editing for just edit. I find it really hard to watch myself talk about things. I find it like I just like all of that makes me super nervous. I get nervous whenever I sort of realize I'm on screen. When I, you know, it's easy to forget that you're on screen and just sort of fall into a pattern. And but I love the conversation that you can have with people. I love the back and forth. Sometimes I'll be talking about something and somebody will explain a thing to me, and I go, "Oh, they might have a detail that I missed. They might have a question that I missed." And all of that is really, in some ways, it's like being at the Court of Appeal. I like a hot appellate bench where they come
Yeah.
at you with questions. I went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it was the best court appearance, like the best court experience I've ever had, because I was sort of warned. I was like, they're not going to give you a whole amount of time. The guy who was sort of prepping me, I had a mentor slash filing agent slash, and he's like, everything you want to say, you will have about 2 minutes that they will let you talk uninterrupted. So put whatever you need to say into that 2 minutes, because after that, it's just going to be questions. I was like,
Just shooting from the hip.
and that was exactly it. I just start in. I started my spiel with the critical points, and then they're like, Mr. Runkle, I want to ask you this question about the worst part of your case. And
Mhm.
that's so much fun. It's a real mix. I never expected to be doing this, and I still, when I'm in court, I still like grab the podium because I'm nervous and I don't want to
Mhm.
fidget. I Every time I go to trial, I'm anxious because there's always, stakes at it, and it's public speaking. It's difficult. So, I mean, one of the hardest videos I ever did was reviewing I did a live stream commentary on my own Supreme Court appearance going, I wish I hadn't said that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you could notice, but I'm super nervous at this point. I am struggling here, and then here I'm relaxing a little bit more because I'm getting into the flow of things. But it's yeah,
I know that you have also in part of the growth of your channel, something I really admire is kind of embraced the larger YouTube, true crime, law tube, whatever you want to call it, community. I know that, well, I don't want to assume, but you're friends with Rob from Law and
yeah.
Lumber. Tell us kind of how that started and how you view kind of the embrace of the larger community.
That one is kind of a weird one because so there, at the time there was the Johnny Depp trial, and initially I was not interested in covering the Johnny Depp trial because sure, it's a big celebrity, But my take was basically he's suing for defamation as a big celebrity. The standard to meet is so high. How could he possibly meet that? So I went on a few live streams with friends just to kind of hang out and chat with them, but I was kind of just like, I'm not super interested in this. But I watched some of the testimony and I went, wait a minute. How does he actually have a case here? This makes no sense to me because, like, Amber Heard, if she was less crazy, could have won that case. And
Mm-hmm.
if she'd let, what is his name, Rottenborn, if she'd let him run the case, he could have won it for her. Just the problem is that winning it for her would have also nuked her career because he hinted at it. If he'd gotten up and said, listen, she's got mental health problems. This is how she sees the world. She is like a little broken. Then it would have been like, okay, fine. Or even if they just said when she says abuse, she all she means is like that is mean to her.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that they couldn't run that. They had to save her reputation. They had to run the argument of he's the worst person ever, which the case didn't support at all. But so I started getting interested in this, and I had already planned like 6 months prior to go to a shooting competition in West Virginia. And I went, well, it literally cannot be possible that West Virginia is that far away from Virginia. So, so I extended my stay a bit. I just pushed my flight back a bit to say, oh, I'm going to go because at this point I'm interested. And what I really wanted to see is what is the jury doing here? Is the jury, because juries do weird things, right? Sometimes you think you've got a great case and the jury isn't buying anything you're saying, or the other way around. So I was going like, when Amber Heard testifies, is the jury nodding along with her or are they tuned out?
Yeah.
And the jury was the one thing they weren't showing us. I'm going,
And you're so true that that is probably the best barometer of how the case is going is the jury's reaction, and we never get to see it in court.
yep. And even when you're running a trial, you can't pay attention to the jury. I've seen like, so here it can be worthwhile to have a second lawyer sit in so that when you're doing a cross examination, the lawyer can be like, yeah, the jury was completely tuned out when you were
Yeah.
asking about like how you knew where the gun was. They were uninterested in that. But when you asked, do you know that this is the right person? They were focused on that. So we need to lean more into, is this the right guy, as opposed to the gun issue.
Yeah.
And but I wanted to see it, so I made those arrangements. And what is it? And Rob was like, I'm also going to go and watch the trial. And I was like, dang it. We're both going to be there. We're both going to be covering this thing. But, you know, I reached, or I think he reached out to me. He was given sort of my contact info by Alita. And he was like, hey, where are you going to be staying when you're there? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I just haven't figured that out, because at the end of the day, what I was planning on doing was just going there and going into hotels with my laptop and being like, I'm going to run a Wi-Fi test. And if your Wi-Fi is good enough, I'll stay here, because I wanted to do live streaming and so forth. And he's like, or you could stay with me and I've got a good internet connection and like I got a spot to put you up. And I was like, seriously? And he's like, yeah. So I went, okay. So I went off to, stay with a guy I'd never met, and who technically, I guess we were competing in the for the coverage, because sometimes he'd do a stream and then I'd do a stream. And but it was just one of those circumstances where you meet somebody and you're just like, this is such a great guy. And it was such a crazy time, because covering that trial was difficult when you're there in person, because to get into that courtroom, you had to be in that lineup before midnight
Ugh.
every night. Like, you had to be there at like 10. So I'd stay there. I'd sleep as much in the lineup as I could. I'd get in the courtroom. I'd sit there. I'd watch the trial. Afterwards, I'd go back. I would do some live streaming. And then I would get like a few hours of sleep before I had to wake up again and go back to the lineup. And I cannot have been the most fun to deal with because um, I ended up making a poor impression with somebody who sort of a friend of Johnny Depp's, because he came up to me and he's like, "Hey, I'm a friend of Johnny Depp's," and apparently I just sort of walked away from him. And I don't even like I don't know if I kind of thought, "Sure you are," because the problem is that everybody who's claiming to be a friend of Johnny Depp's, usually kind of in their head there was a fair number of sort of odd ducks there, but and I mean, I can't really say I'm not because I was there covering a trial, but there was also there was also just I don't even know if I necessarily like was aware of it because I have like very little memory of a lot of that trial time.
Sounds like it was an exhausting schedule.
It was pretty brutal. Like when you do a week-long trial, those sort of start to feel like they're like there's some light relaxation compared to sometimes when you're doing the streaming. Um Here now I've done days where it's like you're doing trial recaps. And so sometimes I've had things like you go to court and you run a day of trial, you get home, you watch the trial of somebody else on like 2 times speed taking notes, and then you get through that and immediately you're on to do like a recap of something and try to tell people like, "Hey, here's what happened in this trial." And it's a weird thing.
Yeah,
But
no, I'm as you're explaining all of that, I'm wondering where exactly do you fit in sleep? Um,
I
with
joke that I gave up sleep and recreation to do all this,
yeah,
and
right.
so
With the
yeah,
I have with a lot time left that I have with you. I have a couple more questions, but first, you alluded to this a little bit earlier. You said that you were going to West Virginia for a shooting competition.
yeah.
So now only not only are you an expert in gun laws, but it's also a part of your life. Tell us a little bit about these shooting competitions.
So that one was Desert Brutality, and the brutality matches are interesting because they are intentionally kind of suck. And what I mean by that is that so most shooting competitions, you'll do some running, or at least the kind I like best. You'll do some running and some shooting, and some different trading off of things. But the brutality matches often have other elements to them. So one drill, for instance, involves you have a kettlebell, and that kettlebell is often stupid heavy, and you throw it, and where it lands, you go and you take a shot from that position, and you have to hit a target. Once you hit the target, you can ground your rifle, pick up the kettlebell, throw it again, and where it lands is the next spot. And you have to keep doing that until you land a hit from over a finish line. So that
It's like
involves
it's like CrossFit meets shooting competition.
on a time limit, like with time pressures, because that's at the end of the day, your score is the time, the time it takes you to do it. But also, you start learning that shooting in different scenarios can really affect your. Because after the fifth or sixth throw, your arms are getting pretty
I
tired.
bet you're
And
breathing
so when
heavy
you're.
and yeah.
That gun gets heavier as you go. One stage involved, and this was at the same Desert Brutality match, involved they give you a ballistic shield and you run up to a particular point, and then you're engaging targets off the shield, move forward, engage targets off the shield. But they had an actual genuine ballistic shield, and those things are heavy. They're really heavy. And the last part of it was they wanted you to engage a target one-handed with a pistol. And so I'm sitting there and my sight picture is just all over the place. But each time I pull the trigger, I'm having to manually cycle the gun because my arm is so tired and so weak at this point that I don't have the muscle strength to hold it stable enough to allow for the gun to properly cycle.
Wow.
I'm limp
Wow.
wristing it because I'm just tired. And that's never something you'd think about in terms of practicing your shooting skills, is what happens if you are if you're just bog tired. They'll do things like, okay, this target you have to engage off the right side, and this target you have to engage off the left side of cover. And so you have to develop more sort of more rounded skills that you might not otherwise think about. And if you've never tried it before, it is actually difficult to engage a target off your offside off of cover. And like when you play a video game, I was playing some Stalker 2 yesterday. Your Stalker character can peek around cover in either direction with no problem. I'm like, that's way harder than this video game makes it seem. So it's a lot of fun, but sadly, they basically banned those in Canada now, and I'm
Oh.
disappointed because, yeah. Uh,
So you're going to trials and viewing them live, standing in line since the night before. You're doing shooting competitions. With the last couple of minutes I have with you here, tell us, do you have plans for the future with the channel? Anything you want to do different, or is it just kind of continue to provide people with the content that they've all grown to love?
One thing I'm working on, oh, I want to do more. I want to start covering some of the Supreme Court cases in Canada, and at least that allows for some televised stuff. I've got a transcript from one of the famous Canadian trials, and so we can't. There's no video for it. We can't run the video, but one of the things I want to do is run that transcript through like text to speech and
Oh,
try to cover it that way, and just be like, okay, any demeanor or anything you hear in their voices here is fake because we can't do it. But at least that way somebody could, because it's a trial that was super controversial, and I feel like it should be less controversial if people actually hear, like if they knew what the evidence was. So that's a thing. And I honestly want to push at some point, like go into Canadian courtrooms, because the courts here have the ability to permit videotaping, and to just like try to, I want to try to open that door at some point and
yeah.
say, listen, and even if it's just something like, I will pre-record this, and if we end up with something sensitive, we can bleep this out, we can whatever. But and like limit our camera angles. We'll have a camera on the defense lawyer, we'll have a camera on the prosecutor, we'll have a camera on whoever's testifying, and like that's it. Just to get a feel for, but just to say, like, Canadians need to know what our system is like. And I mean, as much as I enjoy covering a lot of these trials, it always makes me wish that I could do that with a Canadian case, and that I didn't have to sometimes be saying like, so the law here in the US in this particular jurisdiction, because I always, you got to look that up, but that's what lawyering is about looking up law, says X. But in Canada, if you're a
Hmm.
Canadian watching, this is how we do it. And like explaining to people, for instance, Rittenhouse, super controversial verdict. And in the States, Rittenhouse is free to go after he gets that jury acquittal. In Canada, it would be 100% that the prosecution would be able to appeal that.
Interesting.
And we have a case like that. It's the case of Peter Cahill. He heard somebody breaking into his car, and he went out with a shotgun, and he says that the person turned on him and he thought that the person was armed. He fired 2 shots and the person was killed, and he was acquitted at his first trial. And then the prosecution appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it gets sent down for a new trial, and at his new trial he was convicted of manslaughter. And in the US he'd be free. Like he would
Yeah.
just be, you ran a trial, he was acquitted, he's done. And this horrifies Americans. Like
It does.
American,
As you're saying it, I'm horrified.
Well, and just think about how this affects the average person, because taking a case up to the Supreme Court, you're probably talking six figures of costs. And so you'll get people who will they'll sell their house to defend against this murder charge. And then by the time it's been through an appeals cycle like that, how much money do you have left?
Mhm.
And you
And
end up
now
with
you're looking at
situations,
another trial because they're going to retry you for manslaughter. Incredible.
and they go from, like, there have been cases where people have gone from like having a team of like very skilled, specialized lawyers dealing with it to legal aid coverage. And legal aid is
Wow.
much better than, much better than sort of people think, because legal aid, but it's not the same as this guy's team of like hand-picked A-listers versus like, hey, this is the guy who took the certificate off the roster. So I think that we have people in jail in Canada who would not be in jail but for running out of money.
Wow. That is a
And
scary thought. Yeah.
yep. So it's
Well,
yeah.
I wish you the absolute best with whatever efforts you make to try to get cameras in the courtroom in Canada. Uh, I would be fascinated to watch it because it does seem like the only people putting trials on are U.S. courts. So it would be interesting to see how things are done in other countries. Ian, this has been such a wonderful and very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Tell people watching, where can they find out more about you if they don't already know, how to go subscribe to your channel and everything else.
So I'm mostly on YouTube as Runkle of the Bailey. That's Runkle. That's a bit of a play on Rumpole of the Bailey, which is a British series about a lawyer. But if you put into Google Runkle of the Bailey, it'll lead you to me, because there's not a lot of Runkles out there. So yeah, check me out. I do commentary primarily on YouTube, although I have a Locals and a Patreon and a Rumble, but YouTube is sort of the big one. So
Thank you again, my friend. This was fantastic.
thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation, and hopefully more.
Absolutely. Take care. We hope you have enjoyed this interview. If there is someone you would like to hear from, a well known creator, or perhaps someone you feel that gets overlooked, please let us know in the comments. Please check out our playlist of past conversations, and we appreciate you all. Please remember to like this episode and subscribe for more content like this. And thank you again for joining us for this episode of Courtroom Confidential Conversations.